Hi everyone, I'm Darshana. So in this particular video, I thought of extending on a video that I did previously on Bayes' theorem and how this idea of priors are very important. And I gave this PCR test as an example, where just because PCR test is positive, you cannot really claim that someone has COVID, because it really depends on the prior distribution, right? So the priors really matter. That's the key idea in Bayesian inference. So in this one I thought of, so if you haven't seen that, I'll put up a link in the description box. You can go and have a look. I would I'd like if you can have a look on that before proceeding on this video, because if particularly if you have forgotten about Bayes' theorem, or if you are not that familiar about Bayes' theorem, because that will be important for our discussion in the discussion on this particular video. So yeah, so the priors are really important. So that's the key idea in Bayes' theorem. So it was, of course, it was introduced by the Reverend Thomas Bayes, and the Bayes' theorem is we visit so the Bayes' theorem is this one, where you have this notion of a prior probability and a posterior probability. Let me give a brief recap on that one. So in Bayes' theorem you have this we have the conditional probabilities, right? Probability of A given B is probability of B given A multiplied by PA divided by PB. Let me check if I got that right. Yeah, so this one is called the prior belief that a certain event is being true, and this is called the posterior, right? So we have some prior belief that a certain event is true, that we cannot directly observe, but then we experience something, and then based on that experience we update that belief, right? So that is called the posterior, right? So it's basically how you update your belief of something that you cannot directly observe, based on something that you can directly observe, right? So based on your observations you update the belief. So that's basically the idea of Bayesian inference. So we need that because sometimes we have to decide on things that we cannot directly observe, like with COVID. We cannot directly observe the COVID, whether someone has, or directly decide whether someone has COVID or not. We have to always go by some indirect observation, right, which is the PCR test being true. So if the PCR test is true, then we can infer that that person has COVID. Those are two different things, right? So so I think in that previous video that I did, what I wanted to highlight was, if the prior distribution is low, then even if the PCR test is positive, the posterior is also very low, right? So the priors matter. Now the key thing in that example was that the prior was a fairly objective value. The prior belief that if you take someone randomly from the entire population, the probability of that person having COVID is a kind of objective value. You can basically obtain that by dividing the known number of COVID infected people by the entire population. So everyone can use that prior, right? So that's a commonly accepted prior. There's no subjectivity in that prior. But what if you what you want to decide on, what you want to determine the probability of, is a more subjective event, or a subjective notion, like whether there's whether there's an afterlife, for example. Now if something like that, the prior belief it's not easy to come up with the objective prior for that, because our priors might be dependent on our upbringing, our cultures, our education system, right, our thought process and the family values and all those things. So depending on that, the prior belief of an afterlife may be different. So what I wanted to highlight is whether that can affect our posterior. So this really relates to the scientific method, because if for something like that, if we apply the scientific method, say you would do some experiment, maybe using near death experience, right? And now in the experimental method, the idea is that you have an objective view. I mean, you start with a prior that is that it can be true or it can be false, like 50% on either side, and then you do some observations, and then you decide on a posterior, right? You based on the observations, you might decide, okay, there's an afterlife or there's no afterlife. But now the problem is that the are the priors really equally distributed, right, in such a problem? Because um, it's very the priors can be very subjective. So even if two people get the same are exposed to the same observations, they might end up with two different conclusions based on the differences of their priors. So that's basically what I wanted to highlight. I mean, if you take a real world example, so now this idea of subjective priors is I haven't seen that explored that much in Bayesian inference, but if you, I mean, if you are someone who's more familiar with Bayesian inference, you can point out any examples in the comment section. But there is a there's a area in Bayesian inference, or or in game theory, where this idea of subjective priors is explored, right? So let me so if we go to Bayesian Games. So game theory is about making strategic decisions where your decision may be dependent on someone else's action, right? So in Bayesian Games, for example, if you take this sheriff's dilemma example, so I mean, this might recall you of some recent events in the US, where there were some police shootings, and immediately everyone assumed that the shootings happened because the police are racist, right? Police is racist. But now they have, I mean, if you take a policeman, the policeman has a limited amount of time to make that call whether to shoot someone or not, and it really depends on their priors, right? Maybe the fact that they are racist, some policeman is racist, might play a part, but it could depend on other things like experience, like the prior belief of that person that they are interacting with, if whether that person is a criminal or a harmless civilian, right? So because based on those priors, they might end up either shooting or not shooting the suspect, right? So that's an example where you use the notion of a subjective prior, and based on the prior, your subsequent action differs, right? Even if both the policemen may experience the same, go through the same, or like have the same set of observations, right? Will have the same experience, but they might end up doing different things. So that, I think, in Bayesian game theory, we can see that the idea of priors are being used in a subjective manner. So what if we apply that to normal Bayesian inference when we decide on an event, whether an event is true or not, whether we can use that kind of a notion of a subjective prior. So if I go back to that previous example of deciding whether there's an afterlife based on some observations, maybe these near death experience. So you interview 100 people who have had near-death experiences, and then you come to some conclusion. So what I want to highlight is that the priors do matter, and even when you apply scientific method to the letter based on the person who's doing the experiment, based on their prior beliefs, they might end up with different conclusions, and that kind of, I think that can lead to a subjectivity of knowledge, or subject, or like relativism of knowledge, or epistemological relativism, because the idea is that based on your priors, even if you have the same set of observations, you might end up with different conclusions, which kind of lead to some sort of relativism, in my opinion. Now you can say that, okay, if suppose they kind of forcefully make sure that they consciously make sure that that they have equal price, right? So the fact that, so before doing the experiment, they consciously determine that, okay, I'm not going to be biased in any way. 50% there's an afterlife, 50% there's no afterlife, and then I'm going to do the experiment. So one thing is, it's very difficult for us to measure that prior, even for that person or someone else to measure that prior, because that's something in their consciousness. So it's very hard to measure something that is there in your consciousness. Maybe you are like 55% positive, 45% negative, or 51% positive, or 49% negative. We don't know, right? The other thing is, some of these priors may not be conscious priors. Now I think in psychology, or even in neuroscience, there has been certain experiments done recently which shows that our conscious thoughts, seemingly conscious thoughts, are based, I mean, there are some unconscious reasons for that. Even some arithmetic computations are sometimes affected by the unconscious mind or the subconscious mind. So the real problem is, we might not even be aware of our priors, right? So I'll share some links to such examples in the description box, where there has been certain experiments in psychology or in neuroscience to show that our conscious thoughts are affected by these unconscious beliefs, maybe based on our upbringing, or things that we might not even be conscious of, right? So that really creates a problem, because then we even don't know our price, we don't even know that such price exists. But so then it really begs the question whether we can ever have an objective conclusion, because the priors can be subjective, and the priors, one thing is, the priors may not be balanced, right? I mean, it may not be equally distributed, the probability of each event. There will be a conscious bias, and worst of all, there can be unconscious biases in the priors. So then, irrespective of the observations that we make, we could end up with different conclusions depending on our priors, which are like conditioned by our culture or education and all those things, and family, so even the scientific method, one could argue, if you apply the Bayesian inference, the idea of priors and Bayesian inference, whether it could really bring about an objective knowledge, right? Or whether that it's still bound by the relativism of knowledge, or the relativism of whether that leads to an epistemological relativism, right? So that's basically what I want to highlight in this video, and I'll share some of the links to some of the things that I discussed in this video in the description, and do have a look. And yeah, that's basically what I want to talk about today, and thanks for watching, and see you again with another video. Thank you.